The most dangerous thing about the Iran conflict is not simply that it is expanding, it is that nearly everyone involved keeps pretending it is still manageable. Washington talks as though more bombing will produce obedience. Tehran talks as though endurance is strategy. Israel talks as though pressure can remain selective. And yet the evidence points in precisely the opposite direction. Missiles have already reached far beyond the expected theatre. Energy facilities have become fair game. The Strait of Hormuz has once again turned into the world's most alarming choke point. And the old assumption that escalation can be calibrated with neat little policy instruments is starting to look faintly ridiculous. So, the real question is not whether this conflict is dangerous. That part is obvious. The real question is why it is becoming so much harder to control, and why every move supposedly designed to restore deterrence seems instead to be multiplying the number of actors, targets, and consequences involved. By the end of this analysis, the audience should be able to see that this is no longer a crisis contained by military arithmetic. It is becoming a systems failure, and systems failures are notoriously bad at respecting anyone's timetable. The first reason is brutally simple. The conflict has moved from shadow war to overt confrontation, and once that threshold is crossed, control becomes vastly more difficult. For years, Iran and its enemies preferred the murky comforts of deniability: cyber attacks, assassinations, covert strikes, militia harassment, the usual theatre of plausible innocence. That ugly arrangement was dangerous, but it had limits. Now those limits are breaking down. Reuters reports that the current war has already spread into attacks on energy infrastructure across Gulf states, disruption to shipping, and strikes affecting Lebanon, Iraq, and beyond. The BBC notes that even sustained military pressure has not produced paralysis in Tehran, which is awkward for those who promised exactly that. In other words, the theory of quick coercion is failing in public. And when coercion fails in public, leaders usually double down rather than admit the obvious. That is how limited action acquires a habit of becoming open-ended punishment, and open-ended punishment rarely stays geographically tidy for very long. But it gets worse because this is not a two-player contest. It never was. Iran's power has long rested not only on its own arsenal, but on a regional armed network built precisely to complicate retaliation. The Council on Foreign Relations describes how the IRGC's Quds Force cultivated Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, Palestinian factions, and the Houthis as a distributed architecture of influence and pressure. That network allows Tehran to threaten Israel, US forces, and commercial shipping without always taking clean ownership of every move. Clever, in the grubby way that many destabilizing strategies are clever. Yet the same network that once gave Iran strategic depth now makes crisis management far more fragile. Every front carries its own incentives: local commanders, prestige calculations, and domestic politics. Hezbollah does not operate on the same clock as Tehran. The Houthis do not measure risk in the same way as Gulf monarchies or Western navies. Iraqi factions have their own theatres of grievance, so when policymakers speak lazily of sending a message to Iran, what they actually mean is setting off vibrations through a web of armed actors, any one of whom can decide the message requires enthusiastic reinterpretation. That is why each supposed act of deterrence keeps producing fresh layers of instability. Attack one node and three others twitch. Strike a facility in Iran and suddenly shipping insurers, Gulf energy operators, militia commanders in Iraq, and missile units in Lebanon are all making calculations of their own. Crisis Group warns that repeated strikes and reprisals are driving a sprawling regional war, precisely because retaliation is no longer confined to the principal combatants. Iran had warned it would target US partners and assets across the region if attacked, and its response has reached beyond military sites to civilian infrastructure and energy installations. This is the point viewers need to hold on to. The mechanism of escalation is no longer linear. It is networked, and networked escalation is much harder to control because no single capital, however self-important, can fully switch it off once momentum takes hold. Leaders may still imagine a dial they can turn up and down. In reality, they are increasingly thumping a machine full of loose wires and hoping the sparks remain decorative. A second reason the conflict is becoming harder to control lies in the sheer strategic muddle surrounding end goals. Crisis Group points to shifting rationales from Washington and Israel: humanitarian concern, nuclear fear, missile threats, preemption, regime degradation, protection of allies, restoration of deterrents. One could almost admire the creativity if it did not involve missiles. This matters because wars without stable political objectives tend to drift toward maximalism. If victory is vaguely defined, then every setback becomes an argument for escalation, and every pause looks like weakness. The BBC makes the same point from another angle: the longer the war goes on, the fewer exit routes remain. Iran cannot easily step back without appearing weak. The US and Israel cannot achieve decisive surrender through air power alone. So all parties become trapped between military insufficiency and political vanity. That is a thoroughly miserable combination. It means the conflict is governed less by a coherent plan than by reputational panic. And reputational panic, history suggests, is one of the most reliable engines of strategic blunder. Now compare that to earlier episodes in the region, because historical context makes the current failure look even more severe. Reuters' account of the Israel-Lebanon border reminds the audience how tit-for-tat exchanges have repeatedly widened into much larger wars. In 1982, border fire and reprisals escalated into a full Israeli invasion reaching Beirut. In 2006, Hezbollah's cross-border raid triggered a 5-week war dominated by Israeli airstrikes and Hezbollah rocket fire, ending without Israel achieving its military objectives. That last part matters enormously. Air power can destroy, punish, and signal. What it often cannot do is impose a stable political settlement on a decentralized adversary embedded in society and willing to absorb pain. That lesson was available. It was not hidden in a cave. It was sitting there in plain historical view, waiting to be ignored by people convinced this time would be different, because their intelligence briefings came with cleaner graphics. But history is rude like that. It keeps returning to embarrass leaders who think precedent is for lesser mortals. And then there is the nuclear dimension, which turns an already unstable conflict into something considerably darker. Reuters reports that the IAEA estimates Iran had 440.9 kilograms of uranium enriched to up to 60% before last year's attacks, enough, if enriched further, for roughly 10 nuclear weapons by the agency's yardstick. The same report says inspectors still lack access to key sites, and that some of the most highly enriched material had been stored in a tunnel complex at Isfahan. So the military campaign has produced a rather splendid paradox. The more the nuclear issue is used to justify pressure, the murkier the actual picture of Iran's program becomes. Bombing may damage facilities, certainly. It may also reduce transparency, disperse materials, harden concealment, and shrink the political space for inspections. That is not control. That is strategic blindness wearing the costume of toughness. And once a conflict acquires a serious verification problem around near bomb-grade uranium, even small incidents become loaded with far greater risk, because nobody can be entirely sure what the other side still has, where it is, or how desperate it may become. If that were not enough, the geography of global trade is now tied directly into the escalation dynamic. Reuters notes that about a fifth of the world's oil consumption passes through the Strait of Hormuz, with more than 20 million barrels of crude, condensate and fuels moving through it each day on average, while Qatar sends almost all of its LNG through the same route. In plain English, this means a regional war can very quickly become a global economic shock. And history offers no comfort here either. Reuters recalls the tanker war of the 1980s, when Iran and Iraq sought to disrupt each other's exports. Today's vulnerability may be worse because modern markets are hyper-reactive, supply chains are tightly wound, and even threats to shipping can send insurers, traders, and governments into a frenzy. This is why control becomes so elusive. Once commercial shipping, port operations, and energy exports are drawn into the contest, the number of stakeholders explodes. Suddenly, this is not merely about Israel, Iran, and the United States. It is about Gulf monarchies, Asian importers, European inflation, freight routes, naval escorts, and domestic fuel prices. A war that threatens everyone's wallets acquires a quite extraordinary capacity to spread politically, even where governments would prefer not to touch it. This is the moment, incidentally, where official language becomes especially absurd. Governments still talk about sending signals and restoring deterrents as though the region were a seminar room full of rational diagrams. But once tankers are attacked, refineries threatened, and civilian infrastructure pulled into the crossfire, signals are no longer clean. They are interpreted through fear. Bahrain declaring force majeure after attacks on its refinery, Iraq cutting output despite avoiding direct strikes, and broader disruptions across Gulf energy networks all illustrate a basic reality. Third parties do not experience escalation as an elegant message. They experience it as chaos, and chaos has a habit of creating its own politics. Protests intensify, domestic pressure rises, neutrality becomes harder to sustain, security services overreact, allied governments demand reassurance, financial markets behave like nervous pigeons in a thunderstorm. So when leaders insist they are calibrating violence for strategic effect, what they are often doing in practice is broadening the list of people with urgent reasons to make bad decisions. There is also a deeper problem of command and credibility. The BBC highlights uncertainty over who in Iran is actually speaking with full authority and who retains operational control over the security apparatus. Even leaving aside the personalities involved, this matters because deterrence depends on readable chains of command. If the opposing system appears resilient enough to keep striking but opaque enough to complicate negotiation, then diplomacy becomes grotesquely difficult. Who offers an off-ramp? Who guarantees compliance? Who can even afford to be seen seeking compromise? At that point, bombing can continue long after diplomacy has lost its address book. The audience should notice the bleak irony here. A campaign sold as a way to force clarity can instead produce greater uncertainty about decision-making on the other side. And uncertainty is combustible. It encourages worst-case assumptions, hasty military planning, and the belief that another strike might finally reveal the truth. It usually does not. It merely adds more rubble to the intelligence picture. Another retention point is crucial here. The conflict is becoming harder to control, not because the actors are irrational, but because each actor is rational within a dangerously broken incentive structure. Iran escalates to preserve deterrence, regime legitimacy, and regional relevance. Israel escalates because living under a growing missile threat is intolerable and delaying confrontation appears even riskier. Washington escalates because backing away after threats would look humiliating, especially once forces are deployed. Gulf states seek distance but host assets that make distance impossible. Militias escalate because restraint does not earn them prestige. Everyone has a logic. Collectively, those logics produce catastrophe. That is often how serious wars work. Not through madness, but through disciplined self-justification. Each player can explain the next move. None can convincingly explain where the sequence ends. And that, more than anything, is why these developments should alarm observers. A conflict becomes truly hard to control when escalation is no longer the product of one villain's whim, but of an entire regional order rewarding retaliation more reliably than restraint. Bringing all this together, the pattern is now painfully clear. The Iran conflict is becoming harder to control because the mechanisms that once kept confrontation partially bounded are breaking down all at once. The shadow war has become overt, proxy pressure has fused with direct retaliation, air power has not delivered decisive political outcomes, nuclear opacity has increased, global trade routes are exposed. Regional actors who did not want a wider war are being dragged into its consequences anyway. And above all, the strategic goals of the principal players remain either contradictory, inflated, or embarrassingly vague. That is a formula not for resolution, but for drift, and drift in a heavily armed region is merely a polite word for danger. If the present trajectory continues, the consequences will reach far beyond the immediate battlefield. Energy insecurity will remain a lever of coercion. Insurance costs and shipping risk will keep transmitting regional violence into global prices. Diplomatic channels will narrow further as public threats replace quiet bargaining. Any future incident involving Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias or nuclear sites could trigger responses far out of proportion to the initial spark, because all sides are already operating in an atmosphere of diminished trust and enlarged stakes. Historians looking back on moments like this rarely describe them as inevitable wars from the beginning. More often, they describe them as crises that became unmanageable because too many decision makers mistook escalation for control. That is the broader significance here. This is not merely a story about Iran. It is a story about what happens when deterrence decays, diplomacy weakens, and governments convince themselves that force can substitute for strategy. In that environment, the conflict does not simply continue. It acquires a momentum of its own. And once a war acquires its own momentum, even powerful states stop directing events and start chasing them.